Hello and welcome. Over the past 3 weeks, we have discussed with some of the world's top experts the geopolitical implications of the Israel-Hamas war. But what is the likely economic fallout of the current military conflict? And what could happen to global growth and the energy markets if this war escalates? There are three broad scenarios that economists are modeling: a limited war between Israel and the Hamas, a regional war which goes on to include the Hezbollah, Syria, the Houthis in Yemen, and then a direct larger war which includes Israel and Iran in military confrontation. To talk about the implications of the conflict on the global economy, I am joined on India Today's news track by one of the world's most widely tracked economic affairs commentators. Joining me live from London, Martin Wolf of the Financial Times. Martin Wolf, welcome.
Pleasure to be with you.
After we've discussed the global economic outlook, to give us a sense of the likely impact on India, I have noted economist Neelkanth Mishra, chairperson of the Unique Identity Authority of India, the UIDAI. So thank you very much, Mr. Mishra, for joining us as well. I want to look at some of the data sets put out by Martin Wolf and the other economists looking at the impact of the current crisis on the global economy. We'll start with oil prices because the Gulf region, a massive hub of oil reserves and production. So let's take a look at what the impact could be in three scenarios. One is the current scenario, the medium scenario, and a large scenario where Martin Wolf expects the Brent crude could potentially go up also to $160. So this is from the World Bank, three scenarios. Let me start by asking Martin Wolf to explain to us, and we'll start, Martin Wolf, with just the current confrontation between Israel and the Hamas. If the war were to stay restricted to a military confrontation between the IDF and the terror outfit Hamas, what impact do you expect on global economy?
I think in that case, it would be immeasurably small. It really would be very insignificant. The only possible effect, in fact, we're seeing it to some extent, is that there will be still a generalized sense of uncertainty about possible escalation in various directions. And uncertainty is itself bad for the world economy. It affects people's willingness to take risk, financial markets, and so forth. We're not seeing anything very dramatic. It's probably nothing like the uncertainty about what the Fed is going to do, but it's something. So wars have some impact on sentiment, but I wouldn't expect the effect to be very dramatic.
Let's come to the second scenario, which is the war escalating to include the Hezbollah, the likes of the Houthis in Yemen, Syria, so proxies of Iran, not Iran directly, but the proxies of Iran getting involved in a military conflict with Israel. How do you see that impact global economy?
Again, I think the direct effect would be pretty small. The uncertainty would increase, and the uncertainty would increase because the fear of further escalation into the Gulf and to Gulf oil producers will become more significant. And people might take that into account in their decision-making, in markets and so forth. But the direct effect of this will be really very small. I mean, just to think of the hugely costly Syrian civil war, it had a very large humanitarian effect, huge numbers of refugees, political effects in Europe as the refugees came, but the economic effects were really very small.
Let's now come to the third scenario, which is Iran directly in military conflict along with its proxies with Israel, which would potentially include the United States getting involved militarily as well in Israel's defense. How would that then larger conflict impact the global economy?
Well, then starts depending on how huge the effects are on oil production and exports from this region. The region as a whole, the Gulf, basically produces about a third of world oil. It contains half of world's reserves, and the Straits of Hormuz at the bottom are the choke point for exports. So if, and it does, as I understand it, wouldn't necessarily be incredibly difficult, somebody, Iran, for example, decided to stop the tankers moving, that would have a truly dramatic effect on the world economy, because the prices of oil might, as the chart shows, shoot up to very high levels, even considerably higher than those. Nobody really knows. It will be significantly more damaging than most of the oil shocks we've seen before. It could be like the first and second oil shocks of the 70s, and these were clearly very, very dramatic events. And of course, high energy prices affect the prices of everything, including the prices of food. So that's very important for developing countries. Particularly, the uncertainty would clearly affect financial markets very significantly too. And of course, if the worst came to the worst, this might even start involving, as you say, not only the United States, but even China and Russia, both of which are interested also in the region. So if the conflict spread in this way, and there are many different possible scenarios, it could become a very major global economic event.
Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in 1990 raised average oil prices 3 months afterwards by 105%. The Arab oil embargo of 1973-74 raised them by 52%. The Iranian Revolution in 78 raised oil prices by 48% globally. Since then, though, there's a lot that's changed. There are more alternate sources of energy. There's more renewable energy as well, shale gas in the US and elsewhere. Therefore, there are some experts who say that you don't look at what happened during Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in 1990 to model what might happen now. Global energy markets have changed, and therefore it needn't come down to a worst case scenario immediately. How do you look at that, sir?
Well, I think it's a perfectly plausible argument, but it's sort of untested. We've undoubtedly reduced the intensity of the oil use in the world economy quite dramatically. I think it's declined by about 60% or so. So the intensity of oil use is diminished. But the concern I have, well, there are two concerns still. Almost certainly what we've eliminated were the easy uses of oil to eliminate. And so the fact that we use less doesn't necessarily mean it's less important, because what we are now using it for are in the sectors where it's really difficult to replace quickly. And the second, which is linked to that, it's the dominant transport fuel today. In the long run, we might imagine a quite different electrified world. But to move things around the world, we need petroleum. It's also very important for chemicals, but that can probably be done without for a little while. But the use of oil in our transport systems, every transport system, remains overwhelmingly dominant, and replacing that in the short run seems to me impossible. So if prices of oil were to increase dramatically, this would affect the transport systems and the economics of the transport systems, the profits of the transport system, the movement of goods, and therefore the cost of everything we move. And it would therefore have, in my view, a very big effect.
Martin Wolf, please stay with me. Neelkanth Mishra, the Indian economy has been poised for takeoff for a long time now. First, we had the Russia-Ukraine conflict on the back of the pandemic, which created uncertainty globally, had a shadow on India as well, and now the Israel-Hamas conflict. From your lens, as someone who's a key part of government and also a renowned economist on the outside, how are you seeing all of what Martin Wolf is saying about the impact globally pan out in the context of the Indian economy? Neelkanth Mishra.
So as Martin was saying, I think GDP and energy are very deeply intertwined, and India net imports 48% of its dense energy needs. So if energy prices globally start going up, then India will be very badly impacted. There is a way to quantify that. India net imports about 1.6 billion barrels every year. So every dollar per barrel is about 1.6 billion dollars. And in, say, the medium scenario, if the midpoint of that range is about, say, $25 higher than here, then we are talking about $38 billion just of higher oil imports. So the terms of trade become adverse. India starts paying $38 billion extra. That's about 1% of GDP, because our GDP is about $3.6 trillion. And some of that can be offset. So as you can expect, the subsidies can go up. Effectively, you're borrowing from the future to sustain current consumption. But nearly half of it will be passed through: higher prices of plastics, higher prices of chemicals, fuel oil, industrial use stuff. And what also happens is that it's not just oil that goes up. Because oil is, if it's going shooting up that much, then edible oil goes up because there's biofuel blending. Corn starts to go up, fertilizer goes up. So if you add all of that up, the impact on the economy for a $25 per barrel increase could be around 1% of GDP. So there can be a substantial impact on GDP if oil prices do shoot up that much.
And also, one is the quantifiable impact on growth. The other is the impact on the psychology of investors, of India Inc., on industrialists wanting to invest back in the Indian economy. We've also got variables like the election playing out, Neelkanth Mishra, in the few months to come. How do you think that might impact the animal spirits of industrialists inside and outside when it comes to looking at the growth prospects of the Indian economy and their own investment appetites?
On that, I'm a bit less worried. See, the major reason why India's economy is doing so well is that, unlike in the rest of the world, where the real estate market is turning down after a 10 to 20-year upturn, like Germany is turning down after 20 years, in India, we've seen a 10-year downturn in real estate, and it's just about starting to turn up. So we are starting to see double-digit volume growth in cement demand. We are starting to see power demand going up, tiles, PVC pipes, everything. So these trends do not fade very quickly. What has been happening also is that electricity demand, and we are starting to see, after 10 years of chronic underinvestment in power generation capacity because of the excesses that happened a decade back, that we are now at the peak of the cycle. Like in September, when heat waves were peaking, we actually had started seeing shortages of power. And therefore, it is necessary now for new investments in power generation. Higher prices of oil will actually accelerate the transition towards green energy and green hydrogen. So it actually could trigger new investments. It also, if you see what happened in Japan in the 70s, the higher prices of oil, and given their external dependency, drove an aggressive move towards improvement in energy efficiency. And so I don't expect this to be overall, creating a lot of negative mood in India. I mean, of course, I think sentiment will turn negative. But the terms of trade shift, in which case, you're paying a lot more for what you were, for the same volume of what you're importing, is something that I think will have an impact. But I think sentiment will not change dramatically.
Martin Wolf, your sense of the impact of the conflict in the Middle East having on an economy like India's?
Yes, I think what has just been said seems to me reasonably plausible. Of the large net oil importing economies, India is, I think, in a relatively good position to withstand the shock. The US, of course, uniquely among the really big economies, is not a net importer, and it's sort of a fortress. But we leave that aside. India's real estate cycle indeed has turned around. The financial sector seems, from what I've seen, I wrote about this in July, in pretty good shape. There seems to be a fair amount of animal spirits. It's a large country with a large domestic market. Trade is more important than it used to be, but not that important. So barring some really big global catastrophe, I would have thought India is in a pretty good position to survive. But all I would stress is these scenarios I put forward are very iffy. I think the small and medium one are pretty well defined. But if we do get into a situation when there are major hostilities in the Gulf itself involving Iran, possibly be prepared to lash out at other countries in the Gulf, then the consequences could conceivably be a bigger disruption than we've ever seen before in oil flows. And if that happens, the global implications are getting to a territory we just haven't experienced. And it's a tail risk. I think it's a very small tail risk, but it's there, and one has to take this into account in one's planning, particularly for a country, a big country like India.
Your colleague Gideon Rachman was with us yesterday, and one of the things he spoke about was the disconcerting similarities between what happened in June 1914 with the assassination of the Archduke in Sarajevo, and how, despite the global powers at that time not wanting confrontation, within a few weeks all the major European powers were at war, and then so was the United States, and then we had what's now called World War I. How much of a concern is that for you? How much of that hangs over the US, over the global economy, that if Iran and Israel were to be militarily involved, it may not necessarily just stay restricted there. There's also, in that axis of resistance, Russia, potentially even China, and it could get far more complicated. Martin Wolf.
It seems to me that that's obviously the worst scenario. And if you look at human history, one can never rule out the possibility of completely mad behavior in this sort of a tit-for-tat situation where neither side wants to back down. But my view is it's a very low risk, not zero, but a very low risk. The people leading the US and China are aware of it. Their vital interests are not at stake here to any overwhelming extent. They want to keep peace. War would be devastating for all parties. Nothing could be achieved by it. Remember, we have nuclear weapons. And I think Russia has enough on its plate right now in Ukraine, to put it mildly, not to want to get actually into another military confrontation, potentially with the US. So my guess is this is a remote possibility. It's definitely not zero, but the plausible assumption is it will be avoided.
One of the global headlines of the past several months has been the growing confrontation and competition between the United States and China. We're now seeing some signs of a thaw, with the White House confirming a meeting between President Biden and Xi Jinping later this month, even though the Chinese haven't spoken about it. How do you see a possible rapprochement, even if it's just very marginal, but nonetheless not a worsening of ties between the United States and China, impact the global growth story? Martin Wolf.
I think there's no question, my colleague Edward Luce has also written about this, that the Americans and I believe the Chinese are really quite keen to cool the temperature. And the way they're trying to do that is to generate a certain amount of precision about what they intend to do, what they don't intend to do, so that the sort of big loose words that have been used in the past about relations between the US and China disappear from the American debate, and the Chinese, they hope, will respond. And there's obviously a very powerful vested interest in both countries in this. This is a confrontation, if it gets significantly worse, that neither side is going to benefit from economically, let alone militarily. So I think it's very, very likely that we're going to see this turn into a manageable conflict. We're at an early stage of this. I still remember very, very well the Cuban Missile Crisis, and there were stages in the 60s when there were really big worries about the relations with the US and the Soviet Union, which were in many ways ideologically more confrontational. And yet they did manage to manage that peacefully, at least in terms of direct confrontation, and I expect that to happen again. Provided that's the case, there will be real economic costs from the decoupling, or the partial de-risking, as it's now called, of relations between the US and China, but barring actual military confrontation or a complete breakdown in economic relations, I think they will be manageable.
Neelkanth, Mishra, from your lens, possible rapprochement between China and the United States, what impact might it have on India? India has been one of the beneficiaries, or at least tried to position itself as a potential beneficiary of the China plus one pivot in global supply chains that a lot of companies seem to be engineering. If China and the US are no longer at loggerheads in the way that they've seemed to be over the past several months, how does that impact the India story and the India pitch?
So the strategic competition between China and the US is not getting over, right? So the fact that China wants to be the preeminent economy by 2049 and the US is saying game on is not going to change because Xi Jinping goes to California, right? This is a temporary cooling of temperatures. I think the strategic competition is not ending. The fact that most American corporates, because of what's happening in China, because of Chinese domestic policies, not just because of the US-China trade war, are now wanting to create alternatives. That's also not something that's going to change. I think the China plus one, and to the extent that India is benefiting from it, those trends, I think, will persist. I think it's very unlikely that with one summit meeting or the spirit of Bali continuing, you will see a complete winding down of all the moves that have been made. So remember that they will remain strategic competitors. If there is a cooling of temperatures, if there is better discussion on multilateral issues, on global issues of climate change, of financing the green transition, I would say that this would be in India's interest. We will see the world thinking as one. We are already we are 18% of the world population. Would be among the, in any case, very badly affected by climate change. So if we see the two big economies, the two big powers coming together and thinking together on some global issues, that's in India's interest.
Okay, there are two big elections. I just want to spend a little bit of time on them. Before we wrap up, I'll start, Martin Wolf, with you, talking about the potential impact of the US presidential elections on America's growth, depending on whether President Biden gets re-elected, if he were to actually contest, and what if Donald Trump were to come in. How, in your view, might that impact what's happening from an economic prism globally and particularly in the US?
May I just say first, I agree completely with what Mr. Mishra said about the wider implications of the competition between the US and China, and that fits into the question you asked. I believe that the next election in the United States is among possibly the most important elections anywhere in my lifetime. The really big question is what it does to the US stance in the world, and to actually the functioning of US democracy. I believe that under Donald Trump, the US would become really significantly more isolationist, certainly significantly more protectionist. It would therefore withdraw from many of its overseas commitments, for example, in Europe, but also increasingly in Asia, with one crucial exception, the confrontation with China, on which he will focus, and where that will go, we really don't know. And of course, the election of Donald Trump will be the election of somebody who, let's be quite blunt about it, tried to organize a coup against the outcome of the last presidential election. That's a pretty massive fact. So I believe it's going to be very, very significant, very difficult for world trade, quite unpredictable for the world economy. The trade part will clearly be worse, but geopolitically, it will create quite enormous uncertainties about the future order. It is crucial to remember that to now, this may change, we live in the world that the United States created. And if the United States essentially abandons that creation, it repudiates that creation in many ways, we're going to live in a different world.
Neelkanth Mishra, in conclusion, there's a big election in India as well. The polls for the moment show Prime Minister Modi and the BJP in front. Elections are elections. You can't quite say till the fat lady sings. As India also goes into election mode over the next several months, how is that likely to impact governance and also, in your view, the impact on growth? Because a lot of key reform moves that someone like you would be pushing for kind of get pushed back because no government at this time, till it's certain that it's won, would ever want to try anything which is anything but populist.
So see, the government, both the elected and the unelected parts of the government are very professional and very, very responsible. So I think whatever is in the country's interest will be done. And the uncertainties and whatever is happening at a domestic level, I think unlike, say, the US or maybe some parts of Europe, the international part of, or international relations are not yet a very major part of domestic policy and domestic debate. So in that sense, there is very little uncertainty on what India's direction will be. And I don't think the elections will distort that.
Okay, I'll leave it over there for the time being. Martin Wolf and Neelkanth Mishra for joining me and sharing your thoughts on the global fallout of the current military conflict and the potential implications for the India story. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed this conversation. For your sharp, incisive inputs, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Great pleasure.
Thank you. We'll slip into a quick break. I'll have more for you when we come back from the other side. Stay with us. Back in a moment.
If you like the video, do like, comment, share and subscribe.